Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. Today is Saturday night. It is October 13th, 2018, and tonight we're going to do some speculation as part of the Smaulgld Saturday Night Speculation Series live stream. Tonight's speculation. Will the next Congress audit the Fed and impeach its governors? I've got some interesting historical information for you that I'm going to share during the speculation. But first, let's take a look quickly at the gold and silver prices and the crypto prices. Gold had a big week this week, up to 12.17, and silver up to 14.58. Markets are now closed. They reopened Sunday night. Cryptocurrencies pretty much stabilized this week after having a bit of a fall. Bitcoin right now at 6,200. Pretty much flat over the last 24 hours. Bitcoin Cash 442, pretty much flat over the last 24 hours. Same with Ethereum, flat at 196, and Litecoin at 52.96, flat, and Ethereum at 942, down about 1%. Only news, pretty big news, is Litecoin will be trading next week on the Gemini platform. All right. Let's take a look now at tonight's speculative question. Will the next Congress audit the Fed and impeach its governors? Now, a lot of talk we've had lately about impeach Trump, impeach Kavanaugh, and that seems to be a political weapon. You can impeach someone that you don't like, but actually, in order to successfully impeach any person holding office, you have to allege that they have committed high crimes or misdemeanors, and then you have to bring the charges, and the Senate has to vote and convict that person by a 2/3 vote in order to get rid of them. So it's a very high bar. Now, why do I ask if they will do this to the Fed? Well, first of all, the Republicans have undergone a very big transformation. Half the party was split down the middle. There were never Trumpers. And then, of course, all the Democrats were never Trumpers. So Trump had little support. Now, I just finished watching Trump's speech in Kentucky, and he seems to have the full support of Rand Paul and McConnell, who was pretty much totally against him, who is now glowing in, he thinks, his grandest achievements these past 2 years in appointing or helping push through the Senate 84 judicial appointees, including 2 Supreme Court justices. So you have seen a transformation of the Republican Party. The never-Trumpers are no longer in office. John McCain has died. Jeff Flake is leaving office. Paul Ryan, who was always lukewarm on Trump, is leaving. Corker in Tennessee is leaving. Boehner is gone. As we mentioned, McConnell is now on the Trump side, as is Rand Paul from Kentucky. And Lindsey Graham is now an ardent supporter of Donald Trump, having spent the last few years pretty much hiding behind John McCain and sniping at the president. And, of course, Ted Cruz has also come out in favor of Donald Trump. Now, what does this mean? One of the problems that the Republicans have had over the past years is really pushing forward their agenda. So if they wanted to be against Obamacare, they would hem and haw that they wanted to repeal it, and then when push came to shove, they repeal it knowing that President Obama would veto that, and they wouldn't be able to muster the votes to override his veto. And we saw it again in, I think it was 2017, when they tried to repeal Obamacare at the last minute. John McCain had voted not to repeal Obamacare. So what we have the possibility of in 2018 in these midterm elections, assuming the Republicans hold both the Senate and the Congress, which is a possibility. Now, it's quite possible if they don't, but if they do, well, then you have a more unified Republican Party. Now, let's just go quickly back to 2015 when the Federal Reserve Transparency Act, which was somewhat of a watered-down version of Audit the Fed, just barely missed getting passed. And that was sponsored by Rand Paul and Congressman Tom Massey. Going back 5-7 years earlier, Rand Paul's father had always been trying to audit the Fed, and indeed has argued to and the Fed. But that's never gotten anywhere. And my point being is that if there's two things that could happen. If the Republicans hold on to the Senate and the Congress, the people that they bring into the Congress and into the Senate would tip the balance towards actually possibly being unified, at least towards wanting to audit the Fed. Now, why do I say then impeach the Fed governors? Well, first of all, an audit of the Fed may lead to finding things that could indeed be high crimes and misdemeanors. There's certain things that the Fed briefly is a creature or a creation of Congress, but in a sense, and its governors are appointed, they're political appointees, but they're essentially a private bank. But they still have to act in accordance with the mandates and the restrictions that the Congress has. So if they're found to have done something wrong in the audit, it's possible that they could impeach. Now, why are we talking about impeachment? What would that mean? Well, first of all, why would they even want to impeach the Fed governors and remove them? Well, Donald Trump right now is in an uproar that he thinks the Fed is working against him by raising rates 7 times during his since he's been elected, 6 times during his presidency and once right after he was elected. And that, in a sense, that could be working against him to grind the economy down and potentially hurt his chances in 2020. And that could also hurt the chances for the Republicans in 2020. So if they were to audit the Fed and find out that they've done something wrong and they continue on this rate policy, they couldn't impeach them for raising rates, but they could impeach them for things that they might have done over the past 5-10 years. And really, what a lot of people want to know is what happened during the financial crisis, 2008 and 2009. There have been congressional hearings with Bernanke where they basically refused to answer exactly where a lot of money went. And of course, they may have independence, but they have to be transparent or they have to answer questions. And if they've committed crimes, I'm not saying they have, but an audit may show things that may appear to be unseemly. Now, has this ever happened before? Well, I did some research on this, and because with all this impeachment talk, I was always wondering, well, what about the Fed? Could you impeach the Fed? And actually, you can. Now, there's 3 instances where they had tried to impeach the Fed, the chairman, and the board of governors. And the first time was soon after the Fed was created at the end of 1913 by an act of Congress. Charles Lindbergh's father, who had been a congressman at the time, in 1917, he brought impeachment against the governor, the vice governor, and 3 Fed board members. And he accused them of the 5 active working members of the board. And I'm reading now from his impeachment. I'll leave you the links below in tomorrow's Smaulgld blog post that I post the next day, which includes a copy of this video and then the resources that go along with it. His articles of impeachment said that these 5 active working members of said board of the Fed accused them of high crimes in conspiracy to violate the Constitution and laws of the United States and the just and equitable policies of government. And then he gave his rationale. Now, what's interesting is he wasn't necessarily, and as you'll see as I read through this, it wasn't about specific acts that they took as part of the Fed, but the idea of them creating the Fed. Lindbergh was not yet willing to give in as to the legitimacy of the Fed as an entity in the first place. We're not talking about the actions that the Fed took. So here's what he had to say, very harsh language, that these people did conspire with each other to either devise a means through social, political, and other ways of strategy of or by general chicanery to deceive the people of the United States, the Congress, and the President of the United States for the purpose and with the object to secure an act of Congress, meaning the act of Congress that would create the Fed, providing for a new monetary and banking system to have in a provision for a managing board vested with unusual and extraordinary powers, and to secure the appointment upon the board of management that should be provided in the act, persons for membership on the board who would by subterfuge, manipulation, and false administration so manage as to avoid the spirit and purpose of the people of the United States, the Congress, and the President aimed at in the passage of an act, and instead of administering the act to meet the spirit and comply with its terms, to induce and secure such board to enter into the conspiracy aforesaid, to administer the act for the special benefit and advantage of said conspirators herein before named, and their associates, and so on. So basically, he's accusing them of setting up the Fed in contradiction of the United States, the Constitution, the people, and basically to self-deal. And let me see if there's some more stuff. I mean, the thing goes on, and it is vitriolic. It is against the Fed and the governors, saying that they have duped, they did a conspiracy to pass this through the Congress, and he calls them conspirators. They had secret meetings held by the conspirators, talking about the Fed members, for this purpose, which under the very circumstances would be screened and kept from the public and made practically impossible to discover, but nevertheless made certain of the fact because of acts which point back to their creation, that one of such meetings which a relator does not undertake to verify the truth of its holding, but is reliably informed that it was held. So he's talking about the secret meetings that they held prior to, I guess he's talking about Jekyll Island. And then he mentioned that these meetings are described in Leslie's Illustrated Weekly magazine in the October 19th, 1916 issue. And then he mentions that they've, as a consequence of unlawful acts and misfeasance and so on and so forth, that they, since the passage of the act for private gain, have increased bank credits of the country of approximately 7,000 millions of dollars without affecting a corresponding reduction in the interest rate, thus increasing the aggregate amount of interest paid by the people to the said banks equal to that charged upon said sum, outlining self-dealing. And it goes on and on and on. Now, basically he was saying that this was for the banks and against the people. Charles Lindbergh's dad put this forward. It did not pass. 1934 happened again. And the same type of vitriol. There was a congressman named McFadden. He brought forth impeachment of the Federal Reserve, calling it a corrupt institution. And I read from his impeachment articles. Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks, hereinafter called the Fed. The Fed has cheated the government of these United States and the people of the United States out of enough money to pay the national debt. The depredations and iniquities of the Fed has cost enough money to pay the national debt several times over. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of these United States, has bankrupted itself, and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the defects of the law under which it operates, through the maladministration of that law by the Fed, and through the corrupt practices of the money vultures who control it. He goes on to say, man, this is 1934. Some people who think the Federal Reserve Banks, United States, are United States government institutions. They are not. They are private monopolies which prey upon the people of these United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign customers. Even back then, they were talking about international financial conspiracies. Foreign and domestic speculators and swindlers and rich and predatory money lenders. In that dark crew of financial pirates, there are those who would cut a man's throat to get $1 out of his pocket. There are those who send money into states to buy votes to control our legislatures. There are those who maintain international propaganda for the purposes of deceiving us into granting new concessions. This is before they even gave them the full employment mandate in 1979, which will permit them to cover up their past misdeeds and set again in motion their gigantic train of crime. These guys Ron Paul has nothing on these guys, the way McFadden and Lindbergh described the Fed. Now, interestingly enough, of course, that didn't pass. They were never impeached. But for you conspiracy theorists out there, Congressman Louis T. McFadden died of sudden heart failure and sudden death just 2 years later after, quote, a dose of intestinal flu. And people say that he also suffered an assassination attack. There were revolver shots fired at him when he was getting out of a cab, one of the hotels in Washington, D.C., but both of those shots missed him. But he did become ill after eating at a banquet in Washington, and however, he died from food poisoning, or so they say. A third time that the Fed, or that a congressman brought impeachment articles against the Fed, was as recently as 1985. And there was a congressman named Henry Gonzalez. Now, he was from Texas. He became a congressman in 1961. And indeed, he was in Kennedy's motorcade on November 22nd, 1963. And he heard the shots fired out. He followed the car, and he went all the way to the Parkland Memorial Hospital where Kennedy died. And he actually helped place Kennedy's casket into the hearse as they transported him back to Washington, D.C. Now, he became, I would say, Mr. Impeachment, because he not only brought impeachment against the Fed in 1985, but he also brought impeachment, articles of impeachment against President Reagan in 1983 for his invasion of Grenada. He brought articles of impeachment against Reagan in 1987 for his Iran-Contra activities, and he brought impeachment articles against George Herbert Walker Bush in 1991 for the Iraq War. But in 1985, he brought impeachment articles against, just like the other two had, the head of the Federal Reserve at the time, which was Paul Volcker, and also 6 or 7 or 8 of the members. Also, in 1993, he proposed an audit of the Fed. So we do have historical precedent for removing the Fed officials. Now, what's interesting is that would not necessarily end the Fed, because you would have to replace the Fed, the people in the Fed. Now, that's probably not something that Trump would want to do, because after all, he's appointed Powell, who he seems to be against now, and so I think 1 or 2 of the other new Fed officials, and also some of the Fed officials who were around during the financial crisis have since been replaced. So I don't think that they probably will audit the Fed, but they probably won't move to impeach any of the members. More likely, but not very likely, would be that they might move to end the Fed. There's no point in impeaching the members and then just leaving the institution there and putting new people in there. But we do know that Donald Trump is very much opposed. I wouldn't say he's opposed to the Fed, but he seems to be very much in favor of Andrew Johnson, and he hasn't specifically mentioned that Andrew Johnson was against the creation of the federal bank. The other thing is, I believe he would like, as most countries have, is the finances of the country, if you are to have a central bank, would be at least under the auspices of the Treasury or the United States government. The United States is the only one. There's one other country, and it's some third world country, that actually has this independent type bank. All the other banks, like the Swiss National Bank, by its very name, it's the National Bank of Switzerland. Bank of Japan, it's the Bank of Japan. The United States Bank the Federal Reserve is not the United States Bank. So we'll see what happens, but I think that there is a possibility now more than ever, if the new Republicans do indeed control the Senate and the House, because it seems now they're working together on issues, and if they were so to get behind an audit of the Fed, anything could happen. Now, if they were to audit the Fed and find criminal activity or suspect activity, that might lead calls for ending the Fed. Now, the question is, what would replace it? Again, this is speculation. This is not my prediction or anything. I'm throwing this out there and giving you the historical background of what's happened in the past, and we'll see what happens. So let's see what you guys think in the questions or the comments that you may have had for those people are listening. All right, let's see. Andrew, yeah, okay, let's see. Prashanti Girl, hi Louis, happy to catch the live stream for a change. Well, thank you very much for joining us live. I know a lot of people catch this after it gets uploaded. That's fine too, but if you join live, you can ask questions. Eli's here. Prashanti Girl, was he assassinated? I don't know when you asked that question, so I don't know who you're asking about. I suppose you mean McFarland. I didn't research that. I only saw a brief passing blip on that he did die, and that, you know, that he some people think he may have been poisoned, but I don't know the full ins and outs of that. Z Spec, Smaulgld, did you hear that after President Jackson shut down the central banks, the state banks were worse and it led to an economic nightmare? Yes, you see, that's the thing I mentioned towards the end is, what would the replacement look like? What would happen if they did end the Fed? I mean, the idea of a central bank in and of itself is not evil. A central bank is meant to be a bank of last resort, a bank where if other banks fail, they could backstop them. But the Fed has become far more than that. It's far more. It's in charge of the economy. It's in charge of interest rates. It's in charge of full employment. It's in charge of the money supply. That's not the same thing as just a standard bank of last resort. Yeah, red pilled in the 1930s. Lewis, are we headed for a Black Monday? Well, I don't know what's going to happen on Monday, but my guess is no, but that's not a prediction. You know, the point drops, while they were large, as a percentage, they were only 3% in total, and the market went back up. I mean, for a correction, you got to be 10%. For a bear market, you got to be 20%. Now, of course, the beginning of a bear market doesn't start with a 10% drop or 20%. It could, but hard to say. I mean, interest rates, if the Fed is smart, and again, if they were, what they're trying to do is raise rates because they think the economy is increasing, it doesn't need to have the accommodation that interest rates need to go higher in case they ever need to lower them, they can start talking about slowing the rate hikes, and that would probably call off the dogs on any type of further equity falls and weaken the dollar a bit. I mean, the Fed doesn't want the dollar to be that strong, and of course, if they're acting in good faith, they don't want the stock market to fall either. So I would imagine that if the Fed wants, because a lot of this is financial engineering, if the Fed wants to control the stock market, the economy, and so on, they would probably have gotten a hint already that interest rates have gone up too fast, and so probably I would think that they'll stop talking about raising rates 3 times between now and early next year. But who knows? Eli, true, the Fed raised interest rates 7 times versus 1 times under the previous administration. Well, if you look at it, and I think this is more of coincidence than them trying to favor Democrats, but you never know. They raised them during the Bush administration, and then they lowered them during the Obama administration, and they raised them during the Trump administration. I think they would have probably lowered them during the Obama administration had McCain won anyway, just based on the financial crisis and that the Fed always likes easy money. I think the only reason they're raising them, some people think they're raising them because they're trying to harm Trump. It's possible, but I'm not sure that that's the case. All right, what else here? Prasanthi girl. True, Eli, but it was bound to happen because of the timing cycle. Maybe it's too fast. Though, good to hear by guess, but who knows? Walden tree. U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. The powers of Congress to coin money and regulate the value thereof. The Fed has usurped the congressional power, and we see the results. Yes, indeed there, what they did is they usurped themselves. The Fed didn't usurp the constitutional power. The Congress gave it up. There's a big difference, and I think what Lindbergh was saying, if you were on the stream earlier, I was talking about how Lindbergh's words in his impeachment articles were saying that they were tricked into it, that they connived in order to make this happen. But the blame has to land squarely upon Congress. They were either bribed or they're just plain stupid. But, you know, the Congress it's not just the Congress giving up its power in this instance, but it's also they've given up their power to declare war. Here's a trivia question for the group. When was the last time Congress, who has the sole power to declare war, actually presented a declaration of war? I'll let that one sink in. I'll get to the rest of the questions. So, yes. The Congress, under the Treasury, you know, they still coin money. That's why, you know, your coins, your quarters, dimes, nickels, pennies, and dollars are not Federal Reserve issued. Those are issued by the Treasury through the U.S. Mint. So that they're still doing that, but they have usurped, well, they haven't usurped, they've given up, they've relegated their power to print money, currency, to the Federal Reserve, because if you look on your dollar bill, it says Federal Reserve note. And again, that's not the Bank of the United States. So under most countries, the coinage comes from the Treasury. Now, the United States comes from the Treasury, but not the bills. And I would imagine, you know, when you have dollars in your bank account in digital form, they're exchangeable for Federal Reserve notes, even though there's not enough of them to exchange for, but that's a different story. Cody Mishahunga, he's hungover right now. Yeah, that's not a good feeling. Walden tree, yes, Congress gave up their duty to protect the people. Yeah, well, the other thing that they did in 1913, for those of you who don't know, is Congress, well, not Congress, but the people of the United States, and then they passed a constitutional amendment that allowed for the direct election of senators, which was probably a big mistake, because that made the senators further removed from the people, because the people did not, it used to be that the people elected their state legislatures and they sent two people to Washington. And I was doing a little research on this. Currently, the Republicans control 31 state houses. That would mean they would have sent 62 senators to Washington. But under the current thing, the way it's set up with direct election of senators, they only send 50. So it is a way of making it more of a democracy rather than a democratic republic. And that's why initially they did not have the direct election of senators. The problem with the direct election of senators, you can bribe those senators a lot easier than you can bribe an entire state house to select 2 senators. And then they go to Washington for 6 years. You never see them again. And yes, you are correct, Prashanthi girl. It is World War II was the last time the United States Congress issued a declaration of war. The Korean War was never officially declared by Congress, nor was the Vietnam War, nor was any war since then. The Gulf War, nothing. All right, Jaded Optimist. The Rothschilds on Economist magazine publishes... You know, the Rothschilds don't own the whole thing. I saw a thing on that. They own some of it. I think the Berlusconi family, they're not the sole owners of that magazine, and I don't think they've always been the sole owners. Published article, The World in the Upcoming Year. It is a color for cover every year. The cover of 219 is plain black. Is it the end of us or yours? You know, I don't go for this Rothschilds conspiracy stuff because Well, I don't go for the interpretations of it. The whole world currency supposedly happening this year, they Rothschilds aren't. They can't control whether there's going to be a world currency, and there's not a world currency this year. It's still the dollar. I understand the control that they have and try to exercise through media, through banking, and so on, but I don't necessarily agree with what people's interpretations are of that. So I haven't seen that cover, but it's always worthwhile, you know, paying attention to these things, because there are a lot of hints that are dropped along the way. We the people is no longer in effect. I don't think it, and again, in 1913, Walden Tree, when they gave up when they created direct election of senators, that was a giving up of local control. Also, the people, you know, they passed a constitutional amendment to have income tax. I mean, who would ever tax themselves knowingly like that, their income? But the reason that happened was they were told, well, it's just for the rich people and it's only temporary. You know, now you know everybody has tax. Yes, treason is not too harsh a word to describe what happened in 1913. Punishment should have been appropriate. Well, if you read, and tomorrow you'll get the links on this, for what Lindbergh was saying is essentially that these the board of governors, these people got themselves into that position. He wasn't talking about the direct election of senators, but he was talking about the creation of the Federal Reserve. And if you've read Griffin, the Creature Jekyll Island, you get a flavor of that too. And none of the War Powers Act have been ended since WW2. Yeah, they did, but the War Powers Act was still, what, 40 for 50 or 60? It was like 30 years later. What about the IMF? How have they gained so much power? Well, the IMF now, you got to be careful when you start talking about the different power structures. The IMF was created essentially by the United States and is still controlled by the United States. That's what the Bretton Woods agreements came out of. The United States basically has veto power over any changes to anything significant that happens there. There's a lot of gold now at the IMF. Not a lot, but there's like the third largest stockpile of central banks, right behind Germany at the IMF, and the U.S. essentially controls it. It's not like the United Nations, where the United States pays for it, but they're only one member of the Security Council. They basically have control over the IMF. Pablo Pina, Small, how do you see the Fed interest rates go before they fall and probably to negative territory? Well, I used to believe they would go negative, but I don't believe that they will ever go negative, just because if you want to be a reserve currency, you don't want to go negative. Also, and that's why I thought that they would raise rates off of zero when they did, and everyone said they could never raise rates. Well, you go back to my articles from 2015 and 16, I said they would. When everyone else was saying they couldn't, they wouldn't. And when everyone was saying then they're going to reverse and they're going to go negative. I'm not going to name names of people who said that. But I have always insisted they would raise rates, maybe never normalize them, but that they would get them. And the reason for it is people complaining about the Federal Reserve, people complaining about the debt. Well, I have to realize if you want people to continue to buy bonds, you have to pay interest. Well, the United States pays interest. All the other countries have negative or zero interest rates. That was my main rationale for why they would raise rates. Now, it's a dual-edged sword. You pay interest. That also means now it's tougher to pay because you have to pay interest. But again, a country that's supposed to have the reserve currency can't be in negative interest rates. I don't think that's the right thing. So I don't think that they will go negative. And I think, as I mentioned, depends on where the stock market does. If we continue to get kind of with their numbers, a flatlining of job numbers, a flatlining of inflation, and nothing getting too out of hand either way, or a bit of a slowdown, then I think they'll probably top out at 2.25, 2.5. If, however, according to their stats, the economy looks like it's gearing up, looks like there's going to be inflation, according to their numbers, the inflation numbers that they use, looks like jobs are increasing, wages are increasing, then they just carry on because they believe their own numbers, or at least they claim to set their policy based on those numbers, then they can go as high as 3%. And again, I think they'd like to get as high as they could in order to, two things happen when they go as high as they can. It gives them a chance to bring them down, but also it acts as a weapon against emerging market countries, because the dollar strengthens and then they weaken if they don't like them, like Turkey or so on, because they have difficulty paying back their debts because they have to come up with the dollars, and they're more expensive then. Okay, I know YouTube's saying silver's only good. Well, let's see. Hold on. Let me get back here. Z-Spec 10%. Cody Meshahu. I know a YouTuber saying silver is only good when gold has an overflow of buyers. Well, I tend to agree that silver spikes when gold has had a sustained bull run. And you go back to 1980, you go back to 2011, the two times that silver has significantly spiked, it's because gold was in a multi-year big-time bull market. Gold had been rising from 75, 76 all the way to 1980 when silver finally just took off. But that was also because of the Hunt brothers. But if you look at the price action, I don't have the charts quickly for you right now, between 2009 and 2011, it was gold that was going up significantly, not silver. And then silver just caught fire and spiked up and then took a dive. Are you familiar with Karen Hughes? If yes, what are your thoughts? No comment. YouTube search for Father Coughlin speaking. Yes, Father Coughlin was like a, I don't know what you would call him, rabble-rouser. He was considered by some to be anti-Semitic, but he was also like an America First kind of guy, a conservative voice in the 1930s. Walden tree is not. Okay. Z-Spec. U.S. has been at almost 90% of existence. Yes, I did a... I should put a link tomorrow to it. I have a list of all of the wars and all the debts that the U.S. has gone through. And it didn't really, everyone says, well, it started with the Fed. Actually, the Fed actually helps fund the wars more. Central banking makes it easier for countries to fund wars. But the United States has been at war almost since its entire existence. Okay, pay interest on worthless fiat as partisan guerrilla that came from Ethereum makes sense. Let's think about that. Pay interest on worthless fiat. Well, see, when people say fiat is worthless, it's intrinsically worthless, but it's not worthless in that the entire world economy, you'd have to say, is worthless because the entire world economy is on fiat. So I can't analyze something when people make statements like the dollar is toilet paper. Send me your toilet paper. It may not be ideal, but it's not worthless and it's not toilet paper. And it may be an illusion, it may be a mirage, and it may be unsustainable. But the world does work on fiat. It may not work the way we like it, but billions and billions of value or worth in dollars are transmitted in trillions. And that's how the economy works. That's how people get fed. That's how people pay their rent. That's how people buy stuff. So, yes, but the fact is, though, it is interesting, is why would you even collect taxes if you could just print the money? You know, why do you worry about paying the interest? You just can print the money and pay the interest. John Ingram, only 34 people watching. 32, as a matter of fact. I think we lost 2. All right, partisan guerrilla. It is Saturday night. Fed Reserve or Treasury, why, where, how, WTF. I don't know what that relates to. Partisan guerrilla. It is the truth or industrial complex. Father Coughlin is amazing. Partisan guerrilla. Perceived value. Yes. Fiat dollar. Some fiat has some backing with real assets. But not really, because no fiat currency today. To me, the only currency that I could say is backed is like we had in the 60s, where you could take a dollar and get a silver certificate and then go to the bank and they would give you a Morgan or a Peace dollar. That's real backing. The Bretton Woods Agreement was only backing for foreign central banks, but that was okay, because if you held dollars and you happen to be a central bank, you can get gold from the U.S. Treasury. But Tom, Dick, and Harry couldn't. But I thought always, if you can get silver, that was pretty good. You could take your silver certificate into a bank and they would throw over the counter a silver dollar. But there is no currency today that's backed. No matter how much gold a country has, that doesn't mean anything. Because if a country has gold or a central bank has gold on their balance sheet, it's not available for you, and it doesn't even back the currency or even give it value. So, for example, Russia has 2,000 tons of gold listed on its balance sheet, and the ruble is weak. Why? Because that gold is worth $75 billion. It's not enough to cover much. And it just means they have value at the Treasury. And they have dollars at the Treasury, and they have some other currencies at the Treasury, at their central bank. But it's not backed by gold. So the Russian ruble is valued mostly on its political status, its economic status, its oil exports, but not based on how much gold it has, because if it was based on how much gold it has, it's got an 18% backing, and that's not really helpful. Kazakhstan would be one of the strongest currencies in the world. It's like 44% backed by gold of its reserves for a small country in economic size, not geographic size. Kazakhstan has 330 tons of gold. All right. Walden tree. Colonial American states ran on state-issued fiat, not based on anything except law. Their economy boomed. Yeah, they had those continentals. And now the people traded with real specie. The people traded the pieces of 8, the silver dollars, before they had a U.S. mint. They traded tokens, copper tokens, but they did have fiat dollars. That's correct. Partisan guerrilla. Why have a Treasury and Fed? Something is constitutionally wrong there. Well, and no other country has that. There's 1/3. I wish I knew the name of it. But all countries either have a Treasury and a national bank, but they don't have a Treasury and this third-party private bank with governors appointed by the president. It doesn't make any sense. You're absolutely right. And also, as we mentioned, if you were on earlier, but we have 2 types of coinage. We have U.S. Treasury issued pennies, dimes, nickels, quarters, not even half-dime dollars anymore. They don't make them anymore for circulation. They stopped that in the 80s. I didn't realize that. But also, and the dollar coins they make. Those are not Federal Reserve notes, but the bulk of our money is the Federal Reserve note. Partisan guerrilla. Fiat, in my opinion, is backed by the military force that enforces compliance to use the lifeblood during trade. Yes, but you would think though that Russia would have a stronger currency, and so would China, because they both do some military enforcement of their political or geopolitical will, and their currencies aren't that strong. So it's a combination of the economy, the desirability of the currency, the certainty of payment. China has capital controls. They devalue their currency. They've got a lot of debt. They got more debt than the United States. So that's why China's currency isn't as strong as something like, let's say, the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar. Clearly, the Chinese economy is larger. Clearly, their military is stronger. So it's not just that. It's not just the military. C-Spec, would it be safe to say that silver will rise with gold some when it does happen? My guess, it's not investment advice or even a prediction, but historically, silver does well when gold does really well, and then silver does extraordinarily well when gold does really, really well. But you can see that gold over time, when you have a bear market, doesn't drop as much as silver. I did a YouTube a while back where I showed over the last 40 years that silver's only gone up half the years. It's gone down more than half the years over the last 44, 45 years. And that its 2 biggest drops are 49% and 46%. And that gold has only dropped 32% once. And that silver has dropped like 30% 2 or 3 more times. So like 5 or 6 times silver has dropped 30% in a year in the last 45 years. And gold doesn't have those types of drops. But gold also has never risen 86, 88% like silver did, I think, in 2010. All right. In your opinion, Pablo Pina, Walden Tree, when the Crown mucked it up their economy, they revolted, right? Pablo Pina, your opinion, will we see quantitative easing again if rates come crashing down? Powell seems to be a quantitative tightening chairman. Wouldn't Trump be happy with Ben Bernanke? Well, every person who's in political power always wants, as Mises says, and the people want easy money. When they're out of power, they like to complain about it. I don't think it's because Powell is a tightening guy any more than Bernanke or Yellen. I think they're all trained to be quantitative easing type people. It's just that I think the Fed realized that they got away with a lot. And they almost damaged, and they did damage. They called into question the dollar's hegemony, if you will, by doing QE. The way the dollar came back was the Fed convinced, Stanley Fischer convinced Mario Draghi to do QE. They'd never done QE before. Now, European Union, ECB, has done a longer QE in duration and size than the Fed did. Also buys corporate bonds. Bank of Japan is still doing it. China has issued more credit, I think 70% of the world's credit in the last 6 or 7 years. So now the Fed, having initiated this massive creation of debt and quantitative easing and monetizing debt, is now the country, and bringing interest rates to zero, is the country that is not like that at all. All the other countries have massive debt, massive QE, Bank of England, ECB, Bank of Japan, People's Bank of China, all the Bank of all the other countries are doing massive QE and have zero or negative interest rates, and the U.S. doesn't. And that was the space I thought that the Fed wanted to get against the other countries. And people are still yelling end of the dollar collapse. The dollar is, because of monetary policy, and if you're in a fiat system, the dollar and the Fed have the best or most prudent or most hawkish monetary policies. Why? Because all the other countries have dovish policies, are still printing money, still issuing debt. I mean, China has a ridiculous fiscal policy where they just spend money, or monetary policy if they allow the state-owned banks to keep lending money to state-owned enterprises that don't make money and can't pay back their debts. So all of the entire fiat system, the most prudent central bank in all of it is the Fed, which is hard to imagine, but it is. I would say that Russia's central bank is prudent, and it doesn't have a lot of debt, and it has a decent amount of gold, but the Russian economy doesn't support a strong ruble. Strength in currency you're talking about is, internationally speaking, I mean internally in a country. They're kind of connected, though, because if the dollar is weakened internationally, it's going to be weakened. Nixon tried to make the distinction. When he took the U.S. off the gold standard in 1971, he said, well, yeah, the dollar may be impacted by it not being backed by gold, but you're only going to notice that if you're going to buy imports or you take trips overseas where the dollar won't go that far overseas. But he said, your dollar today will buy as much tomorrow in the United States as it did yesterday, which maybe was true tomorrow, but the next couple of weeks it wasn't. And it's certainly we had inflation as a result. So you can't really separate the internal value and the external value of the dollar, I don't believe. Walden Tree, you can still spend old German Deutschmarks in Germany, notes and coins, they are still fiat currency. I didn't know that. I know I've had issues where you can't use the currency like lira and so on. They generally have grandfather clauses on those where you had to turn them in after a couple of years after they introduced the euro. I didn't know that you could still do it in Germany. I had trouble with turning in Canadian bills. They wouldn't take them at a U.S. bank. I had to go to a Canadian bank, and I never went, so I'm stuck with a couple of dollars worth of Canadian. I think Canada has a good rule. They will always take back their money no matter how old it is. But I saw in Sweden, they wouldn't take back old kroner, and they're not in the euro. A woman, grandmother, had them in a shoebox, and she had them like since the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they wouldn't take them. And the rationale was she couldn't prove where she got the money from. Oh, that's strange. They wouldn't exchange her notes. Yeah, so all U.S. dollars never got out of date until the U.S. collapses, I guess. But you know what's interesting, Walden Tree, and this is what got me interested in cryptocurrencies. Not interested in them, but I used to think, well, why would you want to trade one unbacked currency for another? But a government like India can, at a moment's notice, just decide, well, you know what, your money's no good anymore, so you got to turn it in. If you don't turn it in, you've just lost that money. And that was a wake-up call to me, because I didn't realize I could do that, or if I did, I hadn't been thinking about it. One thing about Bitcoin or Litecoin or any of those currencies is no one can just say, well, they're not worth anything anymore. The market can say that, but the president can't go on TV like Nixon did and say there's no gold backing, but that didn't affect the people because that was for central banks. But the Indian president went on TV and said, nope, this money's no good anymore. And that story with the Swedish woman, same thing. He said, no, those are no good. Now, Bitcoin doesn't have an expiration date, and the government can't tell you it's not worth anything anymore. The buying power of a dollar is less than 2 cents at a time, an exception. That's somewhat misleading, though, Partisan Gorilla. A lot of people like to state that because of inflation, and it's true technically. But the things that you can buy now, there's also been an increase, not equal to. In some respects, the standard of living is higher now than 1913. But certain things that you can buy in 1913, you could buy cheaper than you could now. But there was also a lot of things that you couldn't buy at all, like computers and international travel and so on. But also wages did go up. Now, the point is that wages over the last have not outstripped the inflation that the Fed has created. So it's not really 2%. It's something, it's hard to actually do an apples-to-apples comparison. So I would say, well, maybe a gallon of milk or the things you can buy back then were probably cheaper based on the salary you got. But there's also a lot of things in the standard of living that you have that you didn't have back then. One of the arguments in favor of credit creation, this is what China will tell you, is that you can bring demand forward and you can also bring innovation forward by issuing credit. So, for example, if you want to build a road or a bridge with the latest 21st century technology, you could wait into the 21st century to build it, or you can borrow money in the 20th century and build it in the 20th century and have 21st century technology in advance because you borrowed money. I'm not in favor of that, but that is one argument for issuing credit, is that you can consume now what you can't, or build now what you wouldn't otherwise be able to build if you had to wait for savings to do it. Buying power compared to food. That is correct. That is correct. But remember, it's not the world hasn't stood still, so it's not really it's when people say the dollar is now worthless compared to it was, that's not true. It's lost its value, as you rightly point out, in the food comparison. But Bernanke always says they don't look at the price of food in the calculation of inflation, right? Because those are what do they say about the food and energy? They're volatile and you can't count them. They're not part of the core inflation. All right, everyone, I want to thank you very much for listening. Make sure you get your Smaulgld mugs and join us every night at 8 or 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I'll let you know in advance. And also, please visit Smaulgld.com and subscribe to this channel. Also, check us out on BitChute, Minds.com, Gab.ai, Facebook, Twitter.